Hey, Restorers, welcome to this episode of the Restoration Today podcast. We are here with another market update. David Obert from Verisk is here joining us to talk through more data of what Verisk is seeing as far as claims volume. And in this episode, we're really going to dive into how cat season has affected the industry. Some of the numbers that we're seeing, claim volume, like average dollar on the claims. Are people really filing? Or are people really not? Do people really have flood insurance? Do they really not? There's a lot of components that happened with Helene and Milton in the last few months. So, David, welcome back in. I think this is the third time we've done an update this year, which is super exciting. So, share a little bit about yourself and your background before we jump into it.
Yeah, happy to. So, David Obert, I am Chief Product Officer at Property Estimating Solutions, Exactware, here at Verisk, and been with the company for 20 years now. Been a hot minute. I was all of 11 years old when I started, so
Yes.
that makes me 31. That sounds right. Feels good. That feels good. But anyway, really happy to get the opportunity to talk with you. And I lead out a lot of our product teams. One of the teams that I love working with and have a lot of fun with is our weather team. And so obviously weather data is right at the top of our minds as we think about our claims and claims volume and as we look at predictive analytics and predicting some of the forecasting that we have for weather events and things of that nature. But really enjoy working with that team and enjoy working with all of the teams here at Verisk. But yeah, happy to be with you today.
I think that there's got to be something in the Kool-Aid at Verisk and at Exactor because a lot of people have been there like 20 years or whatever. Like the tenure there is no joke. I know you're not alone in having been there and made a career there, which is hats off to them for making it a place that people stay. So, okay, so talking a little bit about the industry so far. So, a state of the industry report on our end came out last week, and I had kind of branded this year as it's been an interesting year, right? Like claim volume was down at the beginning of the year. Now we're seeing these disasters late, but it started slow because end of 2023 was slow. There was just kind of all these different factors going on, economic factors, inflation, all the things, people not filing claims, people not getting renewed, just lots of things going on, right? So, what is your take on what has happened? Where's the industry at prior to Helene and Milton hitting? Where was the industry at going through, like, I guess those first 9 months of the year?
Yeah, it's a great question. And honestly, Michelle, it has been a fascinating year.
Yeah.
It's been all over the map. And candidly, when we first started looking and when we met earlier this year, we had talked a lot about that claims volume and where we were at versus previous years. And we through May, June timeframe, we just had not seen the level of claims volume that we saw in 2023. It just was not even close. 2023 saw a significant impact related to severe convective storms, and they happen in very populated areas. So you think about Houston area, you think about Dallas, Fort Worth area. There was a lot of impact in 2023 that we just didn't see in 2024. It was a quiet hell year. No question. And our claims volume was way down. I mean, we were looking at 30 to 40% of what 2023 saw in the same time period up through the May timeframe. So it's fascinating just from that lens. Once we started getting into later into the year, and we saw some hail events in Colorado that did increase hail volume. We saw a couple of events in the Texas area that also increased volume, but still significantly below. And then we got into cat season. We saw a whole different picture start to form related to volume once we hit cat season. Beryl started us out in the beginning of cat season, very, very early in the season, which is traditionally not the case. We don't typically see hurricanes form that early in the season. That was kind of a wake-up call for many, and modified some of the predictions for the remainder of the year just because of how early Beryl had hit that Houston area. But up until that point, it just wasn't an active year. One thing that I will highlight though is and what we saw from a severe convective storm perspective, we actually saw a similar number of storms throughout the area that typically sees these types of hail events and things like that. But what we didn't see was the amount of population affected. So we saw a lot of stuff happening in the Oklahoma area and the Nebraska area and things of that nature, where it's more rural. You don't have near as many locations and near as much population. compared to previous years. But generally, it was more or less a similar volume of storms. It just didn't hit these populated areas, which was kind of fascinating. So we're not seeing necessarily a massive reduction in that severe convective storm frequency, but what we are seeing instead is that, or what we did see instead, is that they just weren't hitting some of those populated areas like we saw in previous years.
Interesting. Okay, that's very interesting. So I'm curious, your weather team, after Beryl hit, things kind of like people readjusted, but then things were like, "Whoa," for a minute. I remember talking to Phil Klotzbeck at Colorado State, who I actually met through through an Elevate a few years ago, and I remember he and his team were like, "We don't I don't know."
Yeah.
So what were you guys thinking after Beryl hit and then you were watching, like, did you think that, did you expect more storms to come? Did you think, well, maybe it is going to be a dud? Where were you at?
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating. Yes, we absolutely did, and I think we talked about that.
Yeah.
There were these insane levels of predictions that were coming
Mm,
out because of how early Beryl hit.
yep.
And NOAA actually after Beryl kind of released an updated model from them too. So we had Colorado State. NOAA was kind of factoring in Colorado State. NOAA actually expected 24 named storms after Beryl,
Okay.
13 hurricanes and 7 major hurricanes is what they kind of predicted for the year. So it's pretty high. Colorado State was more in the 30, 33 range. But even NOAA, which was a little bit more conservative in their
Mhm.
predictions, still had pretty high volumes of storm activity that they were expecting. The average, and to maybe put this into context a little bit, the average that we've seen over the course of the last 30 years, we typically see about 14.4. Again, it's an average, so about 14 named storms that we typically see, 7 hurricanes, and only 3 major hurricanes that we see every year. And that's kind of an aggregated average over the course
Yeah.
of the last 30 years. So, given that and the fact that NOAA was sitting there saying, hey, we've got 24, 13, and 7, that's almost double what we traditionally see, which
Yeah.
is that's significant. Again, Colorado State even higher in their predictions. And Colorado State is typically what we NOAA's always a little bit more conservative, makes sense. And so we traditionally kind of factor between the two, and that kind of creates some of our forecasts as we look at what we expect from a claims volume perspective and things of that nature. But here's what actually happened as we go into kind of cat season. So Beryl started us out, and we're thinking, oh man, this is going to be an insanely active
Yep.
season. We had a massive amount of quietness
Yeah.
after Beryl. There wasn't a lot of activity that happened after Beryl, and what actually we ended and we've got a couple things going on right now, and so I'm not counting the things that are kind of out in the Atlantic right now or in the Gulf right now, but what we've seen is 17 named storms, 11 hurricanes, and then 5 major hurricanes is what we've actually experienced this year. So a little bit above average. So that 14 versus 17, 11 versus 7, and 3 versus 5, a little bit above average, certainly, but not to the level that NOAA nor Colorado State were expecting. Um, to put this into context, 2020 was our highest on over the course of the last 30 years. 2020 saw 30 named storms. So that's pretty significant. And there was this perception that we were going to have another 2020, if not higher year, was kind of the perception. And so originally, earlier on in the year, there wasn't that kind of level. But that was kind of the perception.
What contributed to this lull? Why do you think that happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think one of the reasons is the Saharan dust, and we hear about that often, the Saharan dust, and nobody really knows what that means. They're like, there's this dust. I don't know.
Far
But I
away.
think but I think that's one thing is the Saharan dust, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But the second is also just general atmospheric conditions were not really conducive for storms forming. So the Saharan dust, first off, let's talk a little bit about that. So that is effectively dust coming out of Africa that flows over and follows the natural jet stream over the Atlantic. What we find is that it actually slows the formation of tropical storm activity.
Oh,
And the way it does is it reduces the humidity in the air.
sure.
So the water was super conducive for storms forming. The water was warm. We talked about, I mean, a number of times, and we saw a lot of storms forming in the Gulf directly, as opposed to what we
Yes.
typically see, which we see forming in the Atlantic over, out Cuba way and out that way.
Yeah.
But we saw this happening kind of down into the Gulf itself. The Saharan dust was kind of preventing some of that from happening, and it's because that atmospheric absorption that you start seeing that does reduce that humidity as it tries to form, um, which is kind of fascinating. And that's traditionally it's in that main development region of the Atlantic. The other piece that I think is worthy of highlighting is some of the atmospheric conditions. So the wind shear,
Yeah.
which traditionally tears apart those storms. So as they're starting to form, it breaks them apart before they actually have the chance to fully form into a tropical storm. And so between those two items, I think that was kind of some of the reasoning behind why we didn't see quite the level of storm activity that was maybe anticipated. So, and it's hard to predict that type of predict that. NOAA follows that extremely closely, as does Colorado State. A lot of different outlets are following that really closely to try and predict what the activity will be. And this was kind of a unique year where we saw more climate and dust activity than we traditionally see.
Yeah.
And so while the formation elements were there, certainly from a water temperature perspective, just didn't see it actually come to fruition because of some of those other factors. So all those things have to kind of come together in order for us to have an active year, and they didn't quite come together in the way that everybody was anticipating.
That's the first time I've heard the Saharan dust stuff. That's very interesting. Okay. All right, so let's talk about Helene and Milton. They both had big impacts in different ways. Should we talk about Helene first? That was the first one that came through, right? So, what was Helene's impact that what you're seeing in the data now?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. So Helene was fascinating. It was a unique storm. Milton was more along the lines of what we traditionally see. Certainly, Milton it was a very strong storm out in the Gulf, but Helene was very, very big. In fact, it was the largest hurricane on record to hit the Big Bend area.
So Helene was the biggest storm
Yeah.
ever.
Yes.
Okay, so start
Yes.
there.
Yeah. Yeah. So absolutely massive in size. It was one of the largest to ever make landfall in the Big Bend area. It landed as a Cat 4. With sustained wind speeds between 130 and 150 miles an hour, which is, I mean, it's not a slow storm either. But what was fascinating is its trajectory. So we saw another storm hit that Big Bend area, right? And it wasn't near as impactful. Traditionally, the Big Bend area, it's not very populated. There's not a lot of folks that are out there, lots of swamp area, lots of gators. I don't know.
Yeah.
But maybe they didn't like the wind. I don't but
What's
manatees,
happening? Yeah.
I don't know. But either way, traditionally not high impact. But because of the trajectory of Helene and because of the level of wind and sustained wind speed as it continued to go up into Georgia and the Carolinas, the amount of damage was significant. And just as an example, there were tens of millions of properties that actually experienced wind gusts above 30 miles an hour. Tens of millions. So
Wow.
that's unheard of. Tens of
Yeah.
millions for an event.
Yeah.
Now, we don't see damage around 30 miles an hour. That's not true. That's not
Just
terribly
like
fast.
yeah.
It's normally in that 50, 60 and above mile an
Mhm.
hour wind speed that we start seeing damage actually impacted, of which there were still millions of properties that were impacted. But it was fascinating because of its trajectory as it kind of made landfall and then continued up through the Georgia area and the Carolinas. So just its swath of population was huge. So while it hit in an unpopulated area, it still made a lot of impact. Compared to Helene and Milton, Helene actually saw 5 million customers that lost power. That's significant, which extended some of the response for some of those areas. We also saw a significant amount of flooding
Mhm.
in those areas. So we saw definitely we've had claims associated with roofs and sidings and windows. We saw damage related to downed trees and power lines and things of that nature, which you would typically get. But what was specifically unique about Helene was the amount of water that it dumped. Um, that was fascinating. 24 inches in some of the southern Appalachia regions. And when you get into the Appalachia, some of the hilly areas and things of that nature, that exacerbates
Yeah.
the amount of damage related to flood because you get runoff, you get mudslides, you get all of that stuff on top of just the water. And obviously we had and we all saw on the news a lot of areas where rivers were
Yeah.
flooding and going
Terrible.
into it was just absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
So record flooding in many of these locations that are not used to that flood impact. In fact, nationally, what we find is that less than 4% of homes have insurance, flood insurance through NFIP, or even private insurers. So 4% in the hard hit areas like the Carolinas, about 1 to 2% actually have flood insurance. So that's rough
That's
if you think about that, because and rightly so. I mean, how often we look in Utah,
yeah.
and Utah is we're on a fault here in Utah for earthquakes. How many people in Utah have earthquake insurance? It's sub 1% of folks here in Utah that actually have earthquake insurance. But we're on a fault. Doesn't mean it can't happen. Has it happened in the recent past or even not so recent past? No, we haven't had big impact. So nobody really thinks that they need it. The same is true in the Carolinas, where nobody really thinks, especially inland, nobody really thinks they need that flood insurance
No.
to cover. So kind of significant there. So a lot of uninsured losses that happen because of that. So a lot of people are paying for that out of pocket. This obviously impacts economics and the economy of the Carolinas, and it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, whether that's in the home market, whether that's in just the general state economy. It's going to see how this plays out over the course of the next 5 to or 6 to 12 months. So it's going to be fascinating from that perspective.
Can you ever recall a storm that went on the path that Helene did? To do so much damage inland was just wild, and watching it all unfold, and entire towns that were just like here today, gone
Oh, I
tomorrow.
know.
I
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was, I can't even, I know I can't. I mean, like I said, the Big Bend, normally they dissipate really, really fast, and
Yeah.
they don't dump as much water, and the wind speeds drop down. I mean, especially going that direction, it's unheard of. It really is unheard of. And so, certainly Georgia and Carolinas are feeling a lot of that pain right now. And there's a lot of folks, I'm sure, that listen to your podcast that are experiencing this
Yeah.
firsthand, and they're out there in the field working with these people who have had their lives just completely upended where they didn't think it was possible, because they thought, man, I'm completely safe from any of this stuff. I'm way too far inland to have to worry about any of these things.
When it
So
comes to cats, do you see some delay in claims getting filed? Like some people wait weeks, months.
yes.
How long is, like, what does the timeline look like for people to file a claim after a cat, like on average?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. We actually recently did a comparison with Ian versus Milton, and kind of compared those tales
Okay.
of Ian versus Milton, and we've even done that with Helene. And Helene, because it has much more broad impact, we will see a much longer tail with Helene. But Milton, it's impressive. The technologies have really helped help those claims be filed much faster. Far faster than we saw with Ian, certainly far faster than we saw with Katrina. Katrina had a multi-year tail on it.
Yeah.
Ian was we saw that tail significantly dropped off after about 6 months.
Okay.
We're predicting that we'll probably see Milton and Helene continue into early Q1 of 2024. But is it going to go past that? Absolutely not. I don't see it. There will be the onesie twosies, but it's not going to be the volume that we've ever seen. The generally we're seeing a much faster claim process than we've ever seen before. People are getting on these claims much faster. We're seeing them log much faster.
Okay.
And as we're watching the claim volume, we're seeing a massive decrease compared to previous storms that had the same type of impact.
Okay.
So yeah,
Okay.
great question. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about Milton and the impact that Milton has had. Yeah, take it away.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't
Milton,
start my
Milton
question.
was,
Go ahead.
yeah, yeah. Milton was much more compact. That was another fascinating storm. Again, These two storms were very, very different storms. I don't think they could have been any less related to each other than they were. And they were right on the heels of one another,
Yeah.
which is pretty incredible. At its peak intensity, Milton actually was a Cat 5, and it exceeded 157 miles an hour out in the Gulf. It had the fifth lowest minimum central pressure of any Atlantic hurricane. So number 5 in terms of potential energy associated with that storm. So it had so much, and I remember in fact I was watching on AccuWeather. We were sitting there just watching as they were predicting kind of where landfall was going to be made. And I mean, around here when storms are hitting, we're just constantly, we have it on all of our TVs. We're constantly watching what's going on. You see it all over the place because we're trying to brace ourselves and ready ourselves for the volume that we're going to see and try and make sure that we're prepared to help support the industry. And so we're watching this entire thing. And I remember sitting there listening to some of the forecasters on AccuWeather talk about just that central pressure, and just
Mhm.
they were blown away by it. They were just like, this is, and I mean, I'm certainly not as much of a weather nerd as I wish I was. I'm not a scientist by trade, but I find that I start getting really into learning about it. It's like, wow, I can't believe this is happening. And we're on the phone with our weather team and talking to our weather team, our PCS team, and just really getting into the detail with them as we're trying to calculate the potential impact and the potential assignment volume that we're going to see from these storms. So as we're sitting there watching Milton and just the amount of strength that it was garnering out in the Gulf, it was just absolutely incredible. The
Was.
other thing that was fascinating was its trajectory. So they were predicting very clearly that, man, it's gonna storm right through Tampa. Interestingly, Tampa is very, very susceptible to storm surge. It's because it has shallow waters, and obviously there's a significant amount of beachfront homes and things like that. There's a huge amount of urban development right along that coastline,
Yep.
especially along the Tampa Bay. And traditionally Tampa Bay is relatively protected. They don't see a lot of storm impact from directly wind related and things of that nature. It's a very protected area. But the way that it was heading, man, it was looking like it was going to just absolutely pummel Tampa Bay. And we had expectations of significantly higher volume of claims activity based on that. What we actually saw is, and right there at the very end,
Mhm.
I again, we saw that little tweak of trajectory, and it just went slightly south, just barely south. And it was fortuitous, honestly, for the Tampa citizens. The brunt of the storm was not felt. While they still saw that storm surge, there's no question they still saw that storm surge. It was significantly less than what it could have been. So that was fortuitous, certainly for the Tampa area. But what we saw in lieu of is it made landfall, and went right across the peninsula very rapidly. It was not a slow mover, certainly, and hit the Orlando area. Obviously, Orlando saw Cat 1 type of wind
Mhm.
conditions and rain conditions. So heavy rain, strong. But what was fascinating, compared to Helene, so we saw 5 million power outages, people that had power outages with Helene. We only saw 3 with Milton, and that was primarily because it did just kind of cross the peninsula. Far less impact, far more condensed. The other thing is generally we saw less damage, even though it still impacted a significant amount of homes. Florida's building standards have improved significantly since '92. There's been a number of increase in building codes and regulations associated with the way that you build a stormproof home in that area, that region in
Mhm.
Florida. And so there was certainly damage still, and we still saw roofs and things like that, and wind damage, certainly down trees, but generally the construction is far better when compared to what we saw in the trajectory of Helene. Again, people getting
Yeah.
flood damage and things like that they weren't ready for.
Yes.
Floridians have had a significant uptick in the way that they're preparing for these storms, and a
Mhm.
lot of those properties are built for them so that they see less impact. So certainly saw lower volume. When we think about both Helene and Milton together, what we find is that between the two, we're expecting about 1.1 to about 1.3 million claims holistically between the two storms,
Okay.
is what we're anticipating. Obviously, we've seen about I would say 70 to 80% of that already come through the
Okay.
system. So again, like I said, we saw a mass influx very quickly, and a lot of that claims volume is and the benefit to getting those claims settled is that our systems are now built to handle these much faster than
Mhm.
compared to some of these storms that happened, 5, 10, 15 years ago. So that's good to make the policyholder whole, and that's what everybody is trying to do, is trying to get
Yes.
these policyholders whole as rapidly as humanly possible. Um, the other thing that I will mention, just in relation to both of these storms, is that um, because of them and because of the succession of those storms, we actually at Verisk, we had to update our pricing in a midterm pricing update in
Mm.
October. So we had our October pricing update at the first of the month, which we traditionally
Mm.
do. But because of what we saw in increase in activity, we
Yeah.
actually had to put out an incremental update in the middle of October to offset, because we actually did see labor costs rising. We saw material wasn't rising as rapidly as we had seen labor rise, and we obviously model our data based on past what we're seeing happen that has happened, not what we're predicting, but we did actually see that see labor costs increase for the previous 2 weeks. So we wanted to make sure that we release an intermittent update to reflect that. And that was extremely important,
Yeah.
because prices were going up. Obviously, a finite resource in human power to get people out to start repairing some of these homes, and with those two storms falling on the heels of each other, labor was going up,
Yes.
certainly.
For sure.
Material as well, trying to get those into the impacted areas. So
How rare is it to do a midterm update like that?
it is pretty rare. We don't do it very frequently,
I would
and it
think.
requires it. I mean, yeah, it doesn't happen very frequently. We've certainly done it in the past, and some of the
Sure.
larger storms we have done it, but it's the large storms. It's not the small storms that we traditionally do that for. So pretty infrequent.
So for anybody who's listening to this, where can they, if they're not like getting these pricing updates, I'm guessing that if you use Xactimate, that you're getting automated emails and updates from your team. But is there a resource that they can go to like on the website to find these things
Yeah,
if they're missing updates?
yeah. In fact, if you go to our Exactware homepage, you can actually see a lot of that stuff, and we've
Okay.
traditionally post bulletins and stuff on that page. So yeah.
Perfect. Okay. All right. This is a lot of information and data. I
I
love it.
know. I
So
apologize. There's a lot there.
so where are you at planning for 2025? Is your team kind of putting together predictions for weather already? What does that look like? Still too early? Where are we at?
It is a little early, like I said, with severe convective storms specifically, and that's what we'll typically see starting in February and on. We'll start seeing those hailstorms start to form, and we're anticipating a relatively flat year right now.
Okay.
Is kind of what we're predicting is a relatively flat year over 2023. Obviously, there's that element of chance that comes into play.
Always.
Certainly. So, if we see hailstorms that are more impactful in the Dallas Fort Worth area or Austin area or whatever, we're obviously going to see. But just generally with relation to severe convective storm, we're anticipating something similar. I don't know on the hurricane season perspective, it's still pretty early. We're still trying to get through just the remainder of this season.
Yes.
But right now we don't really know. I have a feeling it's going to be similar to this year, based on some of the early models that I've seen. But
It's
we'll
very
see.
early.
Yeah, it's very early. It is
Yeah.
very early. So we'll see how it kind of forms out as we get closer. We start getting and solidifying those around the March April timeframe is when we start getting more clear prediction. But right now my knee jerk is it's probably going to be similar to what we saw this year, just in relation to the number of storms. Maybe not making landfall because obviously there's that chance element. I don't know that we'll see the kind of level of activity that we saw in the Gulf next year that we saw this year. That was unique. That was a very
Mhm.
unique, very unique. So I think we're going to see more probably formation out in the Atlantic and things of that nature versus what we saw this year. But we'll
There.
see. It'll
It
be
came back.
interesting.
I
Oh,
was like,
did
right at the end
I?
it froze. It's back though. Okay, good. Okay, I got nervous again for a second. I'm like, no, but it's back. All right. Well, David, thank you so much for all the information. As always, I always love doing this with you. So thank you very much. And good luck to your team getting through the rest of these claims from these couple storms. And I look forward to catching up with you again in the next few months.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michelle.
For more restoration today and the latest news, visit our website, cnrmagazine.com, and find the latest episodes of the Restoration Today podcast on your favorite podcasting platform.